Thanks for joining us. My name is Ibrahim Sani. As we celebrate Merdeka and Malaysia Day, we tend to ask ourselves what has taken us here and what needs to be done in order for us to grow even further, considering that our neighbours are also growing at a faster pace than us, and we need to understand better in terms of how we can bring this country to greater heights. Joining us on the show is Datuk Nitin Nadkarni, the consultant at LHAG, law firm here in Malaysia. And of course, we're trying to understand a little bit better in terms of how to improve and protect our sovereignty better. Dato, thanks again for taking the time to speak with us. The last time you were here, you went through with us blow by blow in terms of the accounts of, say, for instance, how the Sulu Sultanate claimants are progressing along, how we need to actually look at how we can protect our borders even further. And I find that timely for us to explore again the progress of that particular case, considering that this is a patriotic moment for all of us, and we try to understand a little bit better in terms of how we can bring this country further. Maybe, Dato, you can talk to us through the updates of that particular case and see how we can actually understand this better as we progress as a country.
Okay, well, good morning, Ibrahim, and good morning to all the viewers. Just for a brief background, essentially there was a claim brought by the descendants of the Sulu Sultan arising from the Malaysian government's decision to stop paying 5,300 ringgit a month to them pursuant to an 1878 agreement. They brought an arbitration claim, and a Spanish arbitrator appointed by a Spanish court awarded 14.92 billion US dollars to the Sulu claimants, as he came to the conclusion that the whole state of Sabah and everything in it belonged to the Sulu claimants, and that since he couldn't order the Malaysian government to transfer the state of Sabah to the Sulu claimants, he was going to give them the entire value of that claim. So this, of course, sent shockwaves not only through Malaysia but through the entire world of arbitration, that an arbitrator could make a decision like this touching on the sovereignty of a nation and dealing with these issues. And it raised grave concerns about the way in which the case had been handled through 4 attorneys general and 5 prime ministers, I think. But that was the state of affairs when I came last on the program, but I'm delighted to say there's been extremely good news. I think the current law minister has taken this case extremely seriously, set up a task force.
You're talking about Azalina.
Azalina, and they've done an excellent job. So what has happened since then is that the Paris court, if I can take a step back, what happened in this case was the Spanish arbitrator was appointed by a Spanish court to do the arbitration in Spain. Don't ask me why the Spanish courts thought they had any business appointing an arbitrator to handle a dispute between a Malaysian and a Filipino, between the Malaysian government and Filipino citizens about the state of Sabah, but you know,
it is what it is.
It is what it is. Subsequently, the arbitrator started making his decision, and subsequently on the application of the Malaysian government, the Spanish court set aside the order appointing the arbitrator and ordered him to stop the proceedings. And he took it upon himself to say, no, the Spanish court that appointed him has no jurisdiction to make that order. And he then he made an interim ruling saying that he had jurisdiction to hear the matter. The Sulu claimants registered that award, that interim award, in France, and he then turned around and said, I'm moving my entire arbitration to France because obviously they are a more friendly, arbitration-friendly jurisdiction. What happened then was the French court, the Malaysian government, appealed against the registration of that interim award on jurisdiction and got an order from the French court staying the arbitration. The arbitrator ignored that order and proceeded to give this award. So that's really the legal background. So what's happened since then is the Paris Court of Appeal has very recently set aside the registration of the interim award, saying that the arbitrator had jurisdiction, and said that, well, in fact, there never was an arbitration, or there was no arbitration agreement since 1946, that the arbitration agreement had ceased to have effect, and therefore the arbitrator could never have been appointed. And they set aside that interim award. So it should follow from that that they will also set aside his final award for 14.92 billion. At the same time, the Sulu claimants went off to 2 other jurisdictions to try and register this final award. So they went to the court in The Hague, and The Hague delivered an even more devastating judgment. They said there never had been an arbitration agreement, which is something that as a common lawyer I think is correct. I don't know how the Spanish or French courts could have thought there originally was one. They said there never was an arbitration agreement. They then said that in any event, once the Spanish court had revoked the appointment of the Spanish arbitrator, he had no jurisdiction to continue, and they therefore refused to register the award. Meantime, the Malaysian government has also taken steps in Spain to have the arbitrator tried on criminal charges for ignoring the order of the Spanish court. So at this moment, things look extremely rosy and very good for Malaysia.
You see, the last time you were here on the show, you ended that particular conversation by saying that if we can't even protect our borders, how else can we ensure everything else is enshrined in the Constitution and upheld? Do you feel that this is a step in the right direction where we are doing all we can in protecting our borders, and therefore, I guess, in terms of increasing our sovereignty, we're doing that at the same time?
Now, this government is doing that. This government has been successful. This minister and this task force has done it. But you just compare how the Malaysian governments over the last few years have dealt with this issue and compare it with Pulau Batu Putih. From day one, the Malaysian government put a lot of resources into defending the Pulau Batu Putih claim, took it extremely seriously, and defended that hard. Here, so many things were allowed to happen before we finally took it seriously, set up task force, and did the right things successfully.
The lesson here is, of course, it boils down to personality rather than systems of governance.
No, I'm sorry, I don't agree. I think the lesson here is that the federal government, at least historically, takes very seriously the sovereignty of the peninsula. Do they take so seriously the sovereignty of Sabah and Sarawak?
Based on this evidence, no.
Not only this, you think about the 2008 agreement that was entered into by the under Datuk Badawi, or Tun Badawi as he is now, in which there were said to be 2 blocks of oil alienated to Brunei without consultation with the Sarawak state government or the Sabah state government.
We ceded just like that?
Well, that's the thing. It's all covered in haze and mystery. We really don't know. There was a lot of noise made at that time by politicians, but it's all died into. There's no satisfactory explanation ever been given for that. And right now you see that there's a whole issue about the current government entering into a treaty to define the borders in between Indonesia and Sabah. And some questions have been raised by the former Chief Minister, Datuk Yong Tek Lee, about whether in that process we have ceded certain claims that Malaysia has in respect of, I think it's called the Amlabat grounds. And I don't know what is the outcome. I don't know if the Malaysian government has. The Malaysian government has denied ceding it. So maybe they didn't. I don't know. But clearly, one would think that when we are dealing with Sabah and Sarawak matters, you would take the state governments and the state assemblies into your full confidence when entering into any treaty, in the same way that the Johor state government was taken into full confidence and given a lot of, when we were dealing with Pulau Batu Putih.
Sorry, Dato', you raised a very important point here, in the sense that the federal government is now giving light in terms of taking the sovereignty of the borders of Sabah and Sarawak more seriously than ever. Do you feel that this is because of the political landscape that we are right now? This government is a unity government. It's being propped up by GRS and GPS, and we know that if any of these 2 parties leave, the federal government crumbles. Because of this, do you feel that the seriousness of taking Sabah and Sarawak into the federation is now heading in the right direction because of the ability for them to pull the strings in Putrajaya?
I don't know whether it's because of that. I'm sure that has, that has an important role. But it's also because Sabahans and Sarawakians have woken up and are now demanding that their rights be taken seriously. Again, if we go back in history, in 1976, if you go back historically in 1963, when Malaysia was formed, Sabah and Sarawak were seen as equal partners with the peninsula.
And Singapore.
And Singapore, but Singapore was then left in 1965. In the 1970s, there was an amendment to the federal constitution which treated Sabah and Sarawak as being equal to all the states of the peninsula. Didn't treat them as equal partners to the peninsula, but treated them as merely being the same as any state.
State number 13 and 12.
The interesting thing was when that constitutional provision was promulgated and passed through Parliament, the only MPs that objected to it were DAP MPs. All the MPs in Barisan Nasional who were from Sabah and Sarawak voted in favor of it. That's how they got a 2/3 majority. So there seems to have been less of a prominence on or recognition of the special status of Sabah and Sarawak and their specific importance at that time. That seems to have been woken up. I think even before this government, if you remember when the current governor stepped down, his successor took over. The name before Abang Johari, what was the name of the chief minister then? He was the one who first raised this and said Sarawak must be given its prominence and must be given its role. And that seems to have woken up.
But there has been some, I don't know how to say it, token, I guess, the recognition of Malaysia Day on September 16th.
Well, there's been a reversal of that
promotion of
amendment
state to district or wilayah. And are these token movements?
No, I think they are a healthy sign that Sarawak and Sabah are recognizing that they must be treated not as appendages to Peninsula, but as proud states of their own, as proud territories of their own, and that their rights must be recognized equally. And I think that was part of it. It was also part of the 2018 PH manifesto that they would reinstate Sabah and Sarawak to being equal to the Peninsula. They would amend back the constitution. And that's how that, and eventually that constitutional amendment, they proposed it, it was defeated because they didn't get 2/3. Then Ismail Sabri proposed it and it was unanimous that it was passed through. So there is a growing recognition, I think, that we must not treat them as mere appendages.
What about the
first emergency that was declared in Malaysia was by that great liberal Tunku Abdul Rahman when he toppled the government of Stephen Kalong Ningkan in the 1960s.
But what about the call for 1/3 of a representation in Parliament by Sabah Sarawak? Do you feel that that has grounds and therefore, further delineation has to accommodate this particular?
I think there is a need to redelineate the constituencies in the country as a whole. Quite clearly, I think, was it on your Twitter, I saw that if you went by population, Selangor would have 47 MPs.
That's right.
Out
of 222, based on population alone.
Based on population alone. I saw this on your Twitter, I think.
Thank you.
But, but there is clearly a need to redelineate, and perhaps there is a need to give greater prominence to Sabah and Sarawak. I'll give you another example of where we have ignored Sabah and Sarawak sovereignty. Okay, so dealing with boundaries, we raised this question. Article 2. The second article in the federal constitution says you cannot amend the boundaries of Sabah and Sarawak, or in fact of any state, without a law passed in that state parliament or that state assembly. So how are we giving away tracts of land in 2008 to other people? How are we not treating seriously a claim by some other foreign national to Sabah and Sarawak? Another example of where we don't take it seriously. The federal constitution said that any amendment to the constitution which affected a number of things could not affect Sabah and Sarawak except with the consent of the governor of those states. Now, the federal constitution before 1988 said that judicial powers of the federation vested in the High Court of Malaya and in the High Court of Sabah and Sarawak. In 1988, in a fit of anger, perhaps at various decisions of the court, the federal constitution was amended to say that the court shall only have such powers as are set out by federal law. Now, you could make that amendment to the Peninsula, the High Court of Malaya, because that only requires an amendment in Parliament. But the High Court of Sabah and Sarawak, to amend those powers and amend those provisions, needed the consent of the governors of both Sabah and Sarawak. When you look at the Gazette notification of the legislation, it says that Dewan Rakyat, Dewan Negara and the Agong has approved it. There is no mention of any consultation or approval by the
State Assemblies of Sabah and Sarawak.
not state assemblies,
but
the
the
governors
governors
of the states of Sabah and Sarawak. So once again, we seem to have ridden roughshod over special rights and privileges. And I guess you got to a point where quite rightly these peoples of Sabah and Sarawak are saying, look, hang on a minute. We were promised certain things. We were independent nations before we joined Malaysia, joined Malaya to form Malaysia. Both of them had independence for a short period of time before the merger. And so they're demanding sovereignty. So when we talk about sovereignty, the sovereignty of the nation as a whole and the sovereignty of the particular states and territories of Sabah and Sarawak. So I think there are two good things that have come out. One is we are beginning to recognize as a federal level that they're not mere appendages. They have sovereignty in Sabah and Sarawak, which must be recognized. And that's a great development since 2018. I think if the country is to remain united, then the promises that were made at the time of the creation of Malaysia must be honored. Second, there is a recognition that their sovereignty is just as important as a rock, Pulau Batu Putih, sitting between Malaya Peninsula and Singapore. And what I hope is the third thing that is done is that there is a specific sovereignty department created in the Attorney General's chambers so that the moment there is any attack on sovereignty by anybody, it is immediately swings into action.
Sorry, we don't have such a unit.
I don't know. If we do, then they must have been sleeping when the Sulu claim was brought in. The unit should not depend on the Attorney General. It should be run by civil servants. Irrespective of the government in power, the whole concept of our government is that the civil service continues and keeps the government running on these kinds of mechanisms. The government, the ministers may come and go and make political decisions. That's another matter. But these kind of administrative steps to defend Malaysian sovereignty, on which there is no disagreement between any member of parliament or any minister of any kind, those sorts of things should be institutionalized in the civil service. Whether you have it in the Prime Minister's department, you have it in the AG's chambers.
I speak this with authority because I did interview the former ambassador of Italy and France in Malaysia. They have such a unit, and even the Italian ambassador went so far as saying, we have 20 prime ministers in the past 10 years and the government still chugs along just fine.
Correct.
Because of the civil servants understanding their scope and conduct.
Institutional memory does not come from ministers
That's
who come and go.
yes.
They come from civil servants. Now I'll give you an example of what I mean. The Pulau Batu Putih dispute. There is a very, very good and interesting book written on the Singaporean side and the Singaporean point of view by Professor Jayakumar.
Well,
not
of course,
about
this is
the merits.
POV Singapore.
But it's not so much about the merits of the case. What is in, because I don't necessarily agree with their merits, but so be it, that the International Court of Justice made its decision, but about their preparation process for the case. And their preparation process started in the 1970s, when they had people in London go to Kew Gardens, because in the 1970s they said this could be an issue one day. They went to the British records, took all the British records, detailed those records, and they set up a unit to maintain this. And when they came to the dispute 30 or 40 years later, the very same people who did that research and who had been in charge of it, even though they had retired or become judges or whatever, were pulled back in to fight that case. The very same civil servants, judges, professors came back in to fight. So you had that huge memory, and they started with that. They didn't have to go back to start researching all over. And this is something that is so important for Malaysia, because we live, as I said, in a region where there are disputes. You've got China, I know, they're not hot disputes. It's not going to be like Russia invading Ukraine, but these are issues that we must research. We must have them carefully documented, so that irrespective of attorney generals, irrespective of ministers, that information is there, preserved in our records, in our archives, so that the moment somebody launches any challenge, we have all of that data ready, and we have a unit that swings into action without needing political prompting.
So, you know, you're very clued in terms of the current political landscape. Here in Semenanjung, we've seen the green wave again in 2022, again in 2023. There's a lot of rising tensions in terms of Malays in Semenanjung and the rise of Islam. And there's a lot of support for Islam, rightfully so, because we respect democracy and the political process that goes along with it. And then, of course, you have the Sabah-Sarawak situation and how Sabah and Sarawakians generally do not want to get involved in the shenanigans that is happening in Semenanjung, and they'd rather do their own thing. And then, of course, you have the Prime Minister that is cobbled together, you know, a very handsome, I guess, majority in the Parliament, but it is ever so fragile, if you were to use the word. So with all this, you know, put on the table, how do you think the future governments need to progress, and how do you think the leadership of Datuk Sri Anwar is going to look in the next, I guess, 4 years under this particular term?
I don't have a crystal ball about how these things are going to progress. But what I would say is that if we learn from these mistakes, we should institutionalize within the civil service mechanisms that
But whose
deal
job
with
is that?
That is the job of the government. They should institutionalize these lessons that we should learn.
They're trying to institutionalize. They're trying to say, for instance, separate AG and prosecutor. They're trying to institutionalize many other legal framework in the country.
Well, they're saying it, but I don't know what steps have been taken to actually implement it. There is a difference between anybody can say anything. What we require is concrete steps. Of course, you're right, there may be many political pressures because of things going on all the time, elections every 3 minutes, which draw attention away. So I'm not in government, I can't speak to what steps, measures are being taken. All I can say is we must institutionalize a lot of these matters that are going on. I mean, you talk about the green wave and the rise of Islam, but if you go and talk to any past MP and ask them, should we institutionalize protection of the sovereignty of Malaysia? They'll say yes.
Yeah, of course.
You have to put up a motion, anybody puts up a motion in Parliament, it'll be unanimous. There will not be a single clown who will get up and say no.
Say, why not?
Yeah, I mean, so these are not partisan issues. Sovereignty of Malaysia, sovereignty of the states are not partisan issues. They are non-political, and therefore they can be implemented irrespective of who the Prime Minister is, provided that there is a political will. You won't even find an administrative won't in these kinds of circumstances. There is going to be unanimity. It is simply a question of applying their minds to it. We've already had royal commissions and special commissions who did lots of reports in 2018 and 2019. Those reports are gathering dust. Maybe it's time to pull them down and implement some of those institutional reforms, at least the ones that are non-partisan and not controversial.
I don't know whether we're blessed or cursed by having a lot of lawyers in the Parliament right now as we speak, but should the mandate also fall on these backbenchers to actually make the government work, or at least support Minister Azalina in terms of reforming the judicial process?
I absolutely think so. I mean, why do we appoint MPs? Unfortunately, in the 1980s and 1990s, MPs became members for Longkang Parit, which should have been dealt with at the local assembly level or state assembly level, or even at the administrative level, but it became the issue of the MPs. And MPs were praised for their ability and selected for their ability to deal with these kinds of issues, which are important, I accept, but they have a higher obligation as well. If you're a member of Parliament, you must raise these kinds of issues. And where it is non-partisan, I can't see somebody as sensible as Minister Azalina saying, no, I'm not going to pay attention to this issue.
Of course not.
She'll probably say, okay, you go away and draft a proper proposal for me and we'll put it through.
Yeah.
So yes, we have 222 MPs and there's really no reason why they can't, one of them cannot raise this kind of issue as well.
It can be a private bill. Yeah.
It doesn't even have to have a private bill. You just put it up and see the minister and say, can we do this? Yeah. And I can't see her refusing. Or you see the deputy minister, Gobind, who I can't see him refusing to do it either. Or is it Ram Karpal is the deputy minister? Gobind, I think, is deputy chief minister. Whatever. So the point is, I see no reason why these sinews, institutional structures, the sinews of the civil service cannot be strengthened.
we don't have much time left, but generally speaking, we are heading the right direction, as elucidated by you just now in terms of the progress of the Sulu claimants. There are also calls for the federal government and the MPs and the state assemblies of Sabah and Sarawak to give greater attention to their, I guess, what was promised to them when Malaysia was enshrined together. Do you feel that these progress is actually a positive impact? I'm trying to put an optimistic spin here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am in favor of anything that devolves power away from the federal government towards the states. We are a federal system. We're a funny system that we are a federation, and therefore there should be a lot of powers given to the states, but we are ruled like we are a unitary government. And I don't just mean Sabah and Sarawak.
No.
I think every state should be given a bigger budget, and as much subsidiarity, which is the term that's popular in the European Union, there should be as much power as possible given to each of the states to manage their own affairs. With the federal government dealing with sovereignty issues, we're dealing with defense, dealing with national issues, but the states should be given more power. I think if you want to hold the country together, you need to give the states more power. So if state X says, I want to have a far more Islamic administration, we shouldn't say I'm going to starve that administration of funds. Give it the funds, and let's see if that Islamic administration is able to uplift their people using their government. If they do, good for them. And if Selangor or the Federal Territory, says we want to be a more secular administration, so be it. We shouldn't have one size fits all. The times are gone when daddy knows best.
Yeah, well, that is still around though. Because of this amalgamation of this federation masquerading as a unitary government has taken place during the 80s and 90s. And do you feel that there's still time to unwind this and respect not just the Federation of Malaysia, but to also ensure that Sabah and Sarawak deserve whatever that was promised to them?
Absolutely. I think Sabah and Sarawak, 2/3 of the land area of Malaysia is Sabah and Sarawak. The peninsula is tiny compared to Sabah and Sarawak in terms of land area, in terms of resources, in terms of all of these things. They must be given their due, what was promised to them, and more. If we want Sabah and Sarawak, if we want a strong federation, everybody must be happy within that federation.
Thank you very much, Dato'. Final word as we celebrate Merdeka and Malaysia Day?
Well, as I say, we should celebrate the fact that the Sulu claimants are on the losing end, that this preposterous claim that some individuals in Philippines have sovereign rights over Sabah, a free and democratic state, has been chucked out by the European courts that seem to have in the first place recognized it. So I think that's a wonderful step forward.
Thank you very much. That was Datuk Nitin Nadkarni, the consultant at LHAG. As we celebrate Malaysia Day and Merdeka here at Astro AWANI, we have a lot of resources for you to refer to. Do check astroawani.com for that. My name is Ibrahim Sani. Selamat Hari Merdeka and Selamat Hari Malaysia.